So hello everyone and welcome. Thank you for being here for another Art of Conversation. Today I am honored to introduce our speaker, Dr. Tanya Paul. She is the Isabel and Alfred Bader Curator of European Art at the Milwaukee Art Museum. She received her MA and PhD in art history from the University of Virginia and has been working in museums for over 20 years. In Milwaukee, some exhibitions she has organized include Durer and the German Renaissance, the major traveling exhibition Bouguereau in America, and many more. If any of you had the opportunity to see Bouguereau in America at the Milwaukee Art Museum a few years ago, you know just how fantastic that exhibition was. We're delighted to have Tanya here to discuss Bouguereau and his piece, La Petite Boudeuse, from our collection. And again, thank you for being here, and thank you, Tanya. Please welcome her.
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you, everyone. Let's see. Okay. All right, are you hearing me on the microphone? Yeah, okay, good. So hi, it's a real treat to be here. I'm really honored to come up and to speak about your lovely painting, which I have to say I've now spent some time with, and it's really quite beautiful. You're very lucky to have it in your collection, and it's got a really fascinating history. So today we're going to do a little bit of a dive into who Bouguereau was, his reputation, his market, and then we'll do a little sort of side road into the story of your painting as well, because it's a lot of fun. Bouguereau is obviously an artist very near and dear to my heart. I certainly would not put together an exhibition on his work if I didn't like him. But he's an artist who, you know, he's got some detractors, shall we say, which is why my talk is titled Adored and Abhorred. And we're gonna get into a little bit of why and how that all manifests itself. So in Milwaukee, we are fortunate to also have a wonderful Bouguereau. Ours is a history painting, Homer and His Guide, from 1874, that's in the Leighton Art Collection that we have at the museum. And both of the works, both your painting here and ours in Milwaukee, really exemplify the fine classicizing style that really made Bouguereau as successful as he was as an artist. Whether he painted genre scenes or history paintings or anything in between. But it was also the same classicizing style that is what really got him into trouble, so to speak, with critics. Because they didn't feel that his painting had an authenticity. So one of the quotes I love to read is actually from Winslow Homer, the painter. He said in 1880 of Bouguereau, "I wouldn't cross the street to see a Bouguereau. His pictures look false. He does not get the truth of what he wishes to represent. His light is not out-of-door light. His works are waxy and artificial. They're extremely close to being frauds," which is fighting words, I think, for an artist. So Homer is not alone. There are a number of critics who also echoed that same sentiment. They thought his work was airless, disconnected from reality. But at the same time that all of those critics and detractors were saying these things about Bouguereau, his work was selling for simply staggering prices, and he was very successful. So today we're going to dig into why that was the case. We're going to understand why he was this sort of polarizing figure, and precisely how your lovely painting, which I'm actually really pleased to have just right next to me, fits into that. So here's the man himself, painted by himself in 1879. You can see he is very comfortable, he's well-fed, very well-groomed, very a successful artist. This is not an artist who was struggling, who was trying to make ends meet. There's no sort of Delacroix sort of frenzy in his eye. This is not an artist who is struggling with inner demons. Bouguereau was a very successful man. So he was born in 1825 in the port of La Rochelle in western France. He was the second of 4 children. His father was a wine merchant. He started showing signs of artistic skill at a very young age. and eventually was sent to live with his paternal uncle in the town of La Martiniere in, excuse me, I forget what year, at an early age. Let's just say that. It's a small village about 100 miles west of Paris. And while he was there staying with his uncle, he was instructed in Latin and classics. And he would later go on to say how important that early time, that early study was for him, for really shaping his knowledge of and his interest in historical topics, his interest in the classics, his interest in biblical stories. And so this was a really sort of early pivotal moment for the young artist. In 1841, his father summoned him back home, which was now not in La Rochelle, but it was in Bordeaux. His father had shifted his business from selling wine to selling olive oil, and he said, I want you to come back and work in the family business. And so he installed his son behind a desk in front of a ledger book, and young Bouguereau was quite incorrigible, apparently, and instead of filling the ledger book with neat little sums, he was drawing all over it. And so it became clear that this was not the profession for him. He was not cut out to be an accountant. So with the support of a number of allies, not only his uncle, but also his mother, who was just devoted to his career, long-suffering supporter of him, he was finally allowed to attend the Académie des Beaux-Arts in Bordeaux on a part-time basis, with the understanding from his father that he was going to have to pay his own tuition and he'd have to keep sort of working part-time in his father's business. So he had a series of early successes at competitions and so forth, and then with the support of, again, his paternal uncle, his mother, he eventually made his way to Paris in 1846. And there he enrolled in the Académie Picot, and he devoted his time at the Academy to making what were known as académies, which are studies of either casts of classical sculpture or studies of the nude model. And that sort of study of the human form is something that was really key to Bouguereau's development. You can see it in his paintings. He absolutely knows how to depict bodies and how they sit comfortably in space. You can see it in your painting, you can see it in ours. He had a real mastery of the human form, and that was really foundational to who he was. So he was an incredibly diligent student. And then after several failed attempts, he managed to just qualify to win the prestigious Prix de Rome prize with this particular painting, Zenobia found by the shepherds on the shore of the Araxes. This is a very obscure subject, but gave him an opportunity to depict, again, the human form again and again, the sort of range of gesture and interrelationship of figures. And so he came in second with this painting. He was only allowed to go to Rome for the Prix de Rome because there was an empty space in the Villa Medici in Rome, which is where Prix de Rome winners were got to go live. And so it was decided that he could go and he could be in Rome for a period of 3 years. Normally winners would be allowed to stay for 4, but because there's an empty space and he came in second, we'll let him go for 3 years. So Bouguereau, knew an opportunity when he saw it, he seized it, because the Prix de Rome was a real honor. It was the sort of prize that allowed artists, it really sort of made or broke them. And in Bouguereau's case, it really made him who he was as an artist, because it gave him an opportunity to study not only classical sculpture, but also Renaissance painting, Michelangelo, Raphael, etc., in person, in situ, which for Bouguereau was huge. It was incredibly transformational. And he grabbed the opportunity with both hands. He was incredibly diligent. He was working constantly. And his fellow students actually teased him for that, because he sort of never took part in their social activities. He was required to submit multiple paintings back to the Academy back in Paris during the 3-year period of his studies. And one of them is this painting, which we had in the exhibition back in Milwaukee, which is fantastic. It's from the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. That's the Battle of the Lapiths and Centaurs. And it's obviously a scene drawn from classical mythology, but it's a painting that also really speaks really strongly to the degree to which Bouguereau was influenced by the surroundings he found himself in in Italy. So you can see immediately the kinds of references that the painting is full of, the way that he's looking at everything from the Laocoon and the sort of tension in the figures that you see here, and likewise Gian Bologna's abduction of the Sabine women, the way the woman is being hoisted up and her arm is up overhead echoes this figure right here really beautifully. Sorry, I lost my spot. Interestingly, when he submitted the painting to the Academy, so he had to send these back to Paris, and they would respond to the work that the students were sending back. And the members of the Academy talked about this painting, wrote about this painting to Bouguereau, and they said, if Monsieur Bouguereau was only willing to follow his inspiration, if he gave up this conventional color which fuses together earth and sky, he could hope to rank among the best pupils in the École de Rome. So they're seeing his skill, they're seeing his promise, but they're criticizing his color palette, they're criticizing the sort of his sort of tight focus. And that kind of critical look at Bouguereau, the sort of willingness to admit, yes, okay, he's talented, but, is something that also his fellow students would often express. One of his fellow students, in fact, Charles Garnier, and this is a criticism of Bouguereau's diligence, said of Bouguereau, and this was after they had all returned to Paris, he said the following: ever since Bouguereau left the Villa Medici, he's been plagued by the trick we played on him in Rome. We knew about his work, his tremendous efforts, but we thought he would never amount to much, and so we nicknamed him Sisyphus. The name stuck, and we used to envision him continually hoisting his huge stone in vain. Today, Sisyphus has reached the top of the mountain, and he has planted his rock firmly enough that there is no fear that it will ever roll down. So this comment really is a reflection of the success that Bouguereau was able to achieve, not only during his time in Rome, but once he returned in particular, and the kind of resentment that his peers really had for Bouguereau because he was as successful as he was, almost as if the diligence and the hard work he put into his painting somehow made his painting somehow less. So it's this really interesting dynamic that keeps reoccurring when you read about him, comments about him by his contemporaries. And I find it sort of a fascinating quality about Bouguereau and how he was received. So he returned to his family in Bordeaux. He went on to submit work to the Exposition Universelle in 1855. This was after he'd returned from Rome. And one of the works that he submitted was this really beautiful Fraternal Love from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. We also had this in the show, again, just a gorgeous painting. And he eventually earned the professional recognition that he really desired. He was named Chevalier de la Légion d'honneur in 1858. And the commissions really started rolling in. At that point, he became quite wealthy as a result of that. Really key during this period as well were the connections he made with dealers, the dealers who represented him. Because what Bouguereau was finding was that the grand history paintings he wanted to paint didn't really have a market in Paris anymore, in France anymore. There weren't commissions for churches and commissions for grand sort of civic spaces. Instead, he was finding that genre painting, which he started creating in about the late 1859 to 1860, those paintings were selling. And they were not selling terribly well in France, but they were selling incredibly well in the US and in England. And the reason he discovered this is because of the dealers he was working with. First, he began working with the Durand-Ruel Gallery, and then starting in 1866, he had an exclusive contract with the dealer Goupil. And Goupil was particularly savvy at marketing Bouguereau's work. Initially, so he began, like I said, he started painting genre paintings in 1859. Initially, the genre paintings took on, or had sort of either a foot in mythology, so the work on the left is a great example of that, The Departure of the Shepherd. You can see this is not a like story from antiquity. It's not illustrating a fable or what have you. This is just sort of quasi-mythological figures, sort of it's just, he's leaving for the day and he's saying goodbye to his wife and child. I mean, that's the gist of it. Or he would ground his genre paintings in a sort of sense of pathos, or he would give them this sort of narrative quality, like an indigent family on the left, which is again a really extraordinary picture. And they have this kind of moralizing quality. But eventually he just started painting genre paintings for their own sake. And very crucially as well for his standing in the French art establishment was his successful election, after trying and failing for 12 different times, to the Académie des Beaux-Arts de l'Institut de France in 1876. So he then became one of the sort of arbiters who helped to determine what was considered acceptable, what direction French art was moving in the 19th century. And he became, most crucially, one of the jurors for the annual Salon. And the Salon was, for artists, just an incredibly important event. It was where they would go to have their work exhibited, to have their work seen. And so if you have someone who is standing in opposition to the style you want to paint in and not allowing you to exhibit your work, it really causes problems for a young artist trying to develop. And this is particularly significant because, of course, this is right around the same time that Impressionism was emerging as a modern genre. And Bouguereau was staunchly opposed to that kind of modern approach to painting. So he really placed himself as this kind of arbiter of taste. So as much as we've talked about who Bouguereau was and how he formed artistically, have a little bit of a sense of that now, I actually want to circle back and talk about Bouguereau's market, because that to me is an equally fascinating thing about him. And why it is that he became so popular during his lifetime, and why it is that his work, which seems like it couldn't offend anyone, it's lovely, it's beautifully painted, it's appealing, it's engaging, why so many people were so taken aback by his work or didn't like it. So I particularly love showing this portrait of him. This was taken in his studio in 1904, the year before he died. And we know where both of those paintings are. It's pretty great when you have a photograph of an artist in their studio and you can identify the paintings behind them. And there's a quote underneath it, which there's no way you can read. I can barely read it because it's such a bad image. But it says the following: William Adolphe Bouguereau, easily Prince of academic French art today, painter of Madonnas and Venuses, conventional but charming, a red rag to French critics for his faulty faultlessness, yet eagerly bought by the public. So that's Bouguereau in a nutshell. He's adored and abhorred. He's both. And so I want to talk about that. I want to talk about why, and why critics responded to him in the way that they did. Why people saw his work as too flawless. Why that flawless quality was frustrating to people. And then also think about him in terms of how he stood as a sort of a figure of opposition to the modern. So with that, let's take a moment to kind of unpack that, to look at what critics objected to, and to understand how Bouguereau really came to embody the social aspirations of Gilded Age Americans in particular. As I said, in about 1859, Bouguereau started creating genre paintings, and those genre paintings were incredibly popular with American and British collectors alike. These are some really fine examples of the genre paintings he was creating during this period. Each one focuses on a single figure or pair of figures. They are beautifully rendered. There is a sort of overriding theme in the work on the left. We think about faith, we think about piety. The young girl is sick and they are praying for her health to get her well. So it's a deeply moving and engaging painting. In the work on the right, we think about industry and order and just sort of modesty. And it's this beautiful image of this girl sewing, incredibly engaging, beautiful, limited color palette. So again, within these very simplified confines, single or double figure, sort of overriding sort of a theme or emotion, And then also, in particular in the work on the right, there's this engagement with the viewer by the central figure actually looking out at you and meeting your gaze. Both of these paintings were handled by the dealer Goupil and Company. The Philadelphia painting, the one on the left, changed hands a number of times initially, eventually ending up in London. But by the late 1880s, it was back in Philadelphia. It was in the collection of John Graver Johnson, who was one of the founders, whose art collection was one of the founding collections of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So it quickly made its way to the place it lives today, so to speak. The Girl Sewing also spent some time in a Philadelphia collection, the collection of Clarence Howard Clark. He was the son of a Philadelphia banker, and he inherited a not inconsequential fortune from his father, and then went on to invest and enhance that fortune through investing in railroads and real estate. So it's a really, really typical Gilded Age story, Gilded Age fortune made in those particular industries. He went on to build a large Italianate home, which you're seeing there on the left. It was called Chestnut Wall. That's a picture of it in 1870. And it had within it a really substantial collection of paintings, primarily all 19th century paintings. But he also had ceramics, rare books, and other precious goods. And he even had a room that was described as the Louis XIV's room. So this was really a home that was kind of putting on airs, and this is where this painting lived. The Bouguereau in his collection is actually referenced in volume 3, and this is how we know about the Louis XIV's room. This is how we know about the other works in the collection. It's referenced in this book, Art Treasures of America, by Edward Strahan, which was a monumental 3-volume work that's incredibly important for understanding what Gilded Age collectors were collecting during this period. In that volume, this painting is described as Alsatian peasant girl. It's also described in another volume by another author, George William Sheldon. That series of books were called Artistic Houses. And in that book, this painting is described as a very characteristic figure piece by Bouguereau, which to me is really fascinating because it suggests to me the degree to which Bouguereau's work was so well understood and so easy to pull up for the average reader in America during this period that simply saying a very characteristic figure piece by Bouguereau would call up an image something like this, a single figure, a pair of figures. So it suggests the sort of breadth of awareness of Bouguereau's work. And the mention of Bouguereau's work in these volumes, both of which are just really, they are descriptions of people's houses. They go from city to city, house to house, and they talk about, the various owners of these grand homes, and then they go room by room and talk about the most important objects that they own and describe them in great detail. These volumes really helped define what wealth, what taste kind of meant during this period, and the importance of conspicuous consumption and sort of defining taste during this period. And Strahan's publication in particular was so popular that it was a 3-volume set. You can actually find, these are online, they're entirely scanned. It's fascinating. If you're interested, you can kind of go through and see who owned what, and often there are photographs if you're lucky. Sheldon's book was a 4-volume set. If you look at Strahan's Art Treasures of America, there are very few collections that don't contain Bouguereau's. In fact, more than 2/3 of the collections surveyed by Strahan have at least one, sometimes 2, sometimes more Bouguereau's in them. If we turn back to the chronicler of the other chronicler of homes that I mentioned, George William Sheldon, we encounter another collector, Alexander Turney Stewart, who was known as the Merchant Prince of New York because he made his money through department stores. And I wanted to talk to you about Stewart's home because we have photographs of the interior of Stewart's home as well. We know that Stewart owned 2 Bouguereau's. The one on the left is in the Cummer Museum in Jacksonville, Florida. It's called Return from Harvest. And the one on the right is just down the road in Milwaukee, Homer and his guide. And you can actually see them. I've outlined them in red, but I'll just point them out. So there's Return from Harvest, and there's our Bouguereau, Homer and his guide. And what you can see in these interior shots are the way, and this is the same gallery, just opposite sides of it, the way that this aesthetic had established itself. There is not a spare inch of wall to be seen. I mean, it's paintings literally from floor to ceiling. And then the ceiling curves up, there's this elaborate molding, there are chandeliers, and then there's a skylight overhead. So the idea was that you would see these paintings in natural light. They were packed in cheek by jowl. I mean, there's even paintings leaning against sculptures. It's really like over the top, to say the least. So you can get a sense of like, this is the sort of apex. This is what, someone with newly minted money, with newly formed wealth, this is the kind of home that you can imagine them having and where you can imagine a Bouguereau living. So Clarence Cook, an author who wrote about art and the art market in 1888, said of Bouguereau, "Hardly any modern French painter can be named who is more widely popular than Bouguereau. His pictures always meet with ready sale at large prices, and at the exhibitions they are sure of ready approval by the majority of visitors who would probably pass by Delacroix, Descamps, or Puvis de Chavannes with small notice or none at all." So we know that this is Clark is sort of speaking the truth at this moment. The definition of taste in this moment was helped along by these kinds of volumes, Art Treasures of America, Artistic Homes, etc. But it was also helped along by dealers, and the dealer that Bouguereau worked with most extensively, Goupil, is particularly significant here. He had an exclusive contract with Goupil starting in 1866. Goupil had a deep network of collectors that he sold to, but he also marketed Bouguereau's work, which is really interesting. I mean, to think about an artist being marketed in that way, this is a pretty new thing. This is the sort of birth of this kind of modern art market. And you can see here a work that Bouguereau painted in 1872, Mignon Pensive, so a thoughtful young girl. And then you can see Goupil publishing a print of that same painting in the Illustrated London News in the same year. So this is effectively an advertisement for Bouguereau's painting. And so it's getting the sort of visual presence of Bouguereau further afield. It's spreading the public's awareness of his work, and it's also increasing his visibility in a really interesting way. And it speaks to the degree to which Bouguereau, who was this kind of self-aware artist, started really understanding what the market responded to and began painting more and more and more of that, because he knew this sells well, this is what people are interested in, this is what people respond to. And your painting here at the Rahr-West is very much in that vein. Here I've given your painting some company. I've put it next to Cleveland's really beautiful Rest from 1879 and Syracuse's Little Beggars from 1890. The subjects are either similar or related. You either have young girls, in the case of the Syracuse picture and your picture, or a young family. Everyone is barefoot, there's not a shoe to be found. And everyone is sort of in these sort of rustic clothing, sort of quasi-peasant clothing. It's not specifically defined, but it's sort of this broad allusion to sort of a country life, a sort of idyllic country life. They relate to the kinds of costume studies that Bouguereau was drawing when he was in Rome. So when he wasn't in the city during his time for the Prix de Rome, when he wasn't in the city studying and working, he would go out into the countryside and he would sketch people who lived in the countryside. He would sketch their costumes, he would sketch them going about their days. And so there's an echo of that in these paintings as well. During the summers, he would spend his summers in La Rochelle, and his paintings from that period, that he painted during that time, have this kind of breath and light and air to them that also is reflected in all three of these works. Paintings like these of young people or young families of modest means might seem a little bit incongruous if you think about paintings like these in the context of Alexander Turney Stewart's grand art gallery that we just took a look at. but in fact they fitted in really perfectly. They did that because of Bouguereau's skill, of course, as an artist, but they also, there's a direct social connection that I just want to digress into briefly. They actually allude to what was happening, an actual real social ill that existed and was visible on the streets of New York in the 1860s. So we know that during this period, young Italian children were being brought over to America and sort of exploited by figures who were known as masters or padrones, and they would be forced to work as street musicians. And they were frequently the subject of abuse or ill treatment or even starvation. And this reached a real sort of epidemic level, quite a terrible point in the 1870s, a fever pitch, if you will, when there were a series of young children who were found frozen to death in the snow because they were so ill-treated. And you can see Harper's Weekly with an unfortunate young child who has suffered that fate, illustrated there at the bottom. And of course the public was horrified. There was an outcry at this, and a real desire for change and reform and an end to this horrible practice. This was also similarly happening in France, and there were a number of artistic responses to it. Most famously, Victor Hugo's Les Miserables was written in 1862 in response to precisely the same sort of exploitation of young children. And yet Bouguereau's paintings show us a much gentler version of that. The figures' feet are bare, but they're not dirty. Their clothing is humble, but it's not threadbare. These are not people sort of on death's door. Their cheeks aren't sunken in. They look flush and healthy and comfortable. Because Bouguereau understood who his buyers were, who his market was. And he knew that what was required was a sort of soft sense of pathos, a sense of sympathy with the sitter, with the subject, that would allow the visitor, the viewer of the picture to feel a connection and a sympathy with the plight of the poor without in any way feeling that they had to confront the harsh realities, the realities that are shown in Harper's Weekly here. In addition, for buyers who had newly made wealth and newly built homes to decorate, acquiring a painting by Bouguereau was a far less intimidating thing than acquiring an old master painting, for instance, which might have been an alternative thing to acquire and to fill your home with. Unlike an old master, you didn't need to bring any previous knowledge to acquiring a Bouguereau. There was no chance of being duped by an unscrupulous dealer or acquiring a forgery. You didn't need to have any prior knowledge. You just had to come with an appreciation of the work. With Bouguereau, you knew exactly what you were getting. You essentially got your money's worth, as it were. Clarence Cook, another writer who wrote a volume called Art and Artists of Our Time, wrote of Bouguereau in the 1870s. This is a long quote, but I'm going to read the full thing because I think it's worthwhile. Bouguereau never forgets that he is painting pictures that are to be bought by rich people for the adornment of their drawing rooms, and he takes care that nothing in them shall be out of keeping with the tasteful and elegant things that surround them. Since one of the things that rich and fashionable people take pleasure in is the knowledge that there are others in the world who are not so well off as themselves, Bouguereau has provided for his admirers an ample supply of pretty beggar children, young peasants, mothers of the picturesque poor, and so forth and so on, who are in truth people of the upper classes, or seem to be such, with beautiful faces, fine heads of hair, rich eyes, chiseled lips, ivory skin, hands that never wore gloves, feet that never wore shoes, and in a state of immaculate cleanliness, and in garments that were, if a patch or two is to be seen, is to be accepted as mere symbolism, offends nobody. An irreproachable refinement of sentiment goes hand in hand with this irreproachable taste. The French freedom, which offends so many people here and in England, and many people, be it said in France as well, is never betrayed in Bouguereau's pictures. They are as pure, as passionless, and as cold as Ancroyd could desire. Now, in an orderly society regulated by wholesome rules, dictated by conventional propriety, such a painter is sure of his reward, And as such, a society is naturally founded on sound commercial principles. It is an added recommendation that whoever gets a picture by Bouguereau gets the full worth of his money in finished painting, first-rate drawing, and a subject and treatment that no well-bred person can find fault with. Thank you for indulging me. What I find is so wonderful is that he is also, you can see him going back and forth. He can see and appreciate how beautiful the paintings are. He can see and appreciate how beautifully they're painted, but he is struggling with his feelings and how he feels like Bouguereau is positioning himself and how he feels like Bouguereau is appealing to a particular market. And somehow that seems to make him a little bit uncomfortable, which I find really fascinating. And I think in the paintings that we're looking at right now, you can see that Bouguereau really accomplishes exactly what Cook is talking about. The figures are luminous, they're beautifully portrayed. In fact, you should really look over here because that's much better than a slide. You can see the way that he, in the painting Rest from Cleveland, which I'm sorry, I'm not going to make you look back over here. In the Cleveland picture, the way he's alluding to images of the Holy Family with a peasant family. There's this sort of, you can imagine Mary and Jesus and John the Baptist sort of very easily. There's, again, in the Little Beggars, there's a kind of narrative. In your painting likewise as well, we have this wonderful narrative of these two young girls. Are they sisters? We don't know. We can assume, we can muse, we can wonder. That's the delight of a Bouguereau. It's left open-ended. And the way in which the elder girl is appealing to her younger companion, offering her this ball of yarn with needles in it, and the little girl is coyly looking out at us, the little pouter, sort of refusing to take this ball of yarn and to move forward. We've all seen an obstinate child who doesn't want to do something, and this is a familiar expression. So it's a wonderful work. It fits so beautifully in with what Bouguereau was doing, and it actually has a really fascinating history beyond this. So your painting was painted in 1888. It was first exhibited at the Exposition Universelle in Paris in 1889, which was the very year that the Eiffel Tower was unveiled. So this is the exact same exposition. Your painting was exhibited. There were numerous volumes, numerous books that were published, sort of exploring the various paintings and works that were shown at the Exposition. And your painting is actually illustrated. I'm sorry that it's sideways, but that's how the scan is. And they had it on essentially a double-page spread, which is why it's got that weird jump in it. There were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of paintings shown at the Exposition Universelle. The number that were actually illustrated is very small. So the fact that your painting was actually illustrated in one of these catalogs is really striking. It speaks not only to the significance of the work, but it also speaks to the high regard that Bouguereau was held in. So that to me is really, I think, a fascinating thing right off the bat. We find record of the painting again in 1904. It was published as part of the massive art collection that was built by Charles T. Yerkes, and it appears in volume 2. It's one of 2 Bouguereaus that Yerkes owned. And under the painting is this elaborate description. I'm going to read it again because I love using the words of the people who were looking at these objects at the time to sort of see things how they were seeing them. 2 sisters are sitting in a cottage kitchen, and the smaller one of the twain is being coaxed to take the knitting offered her. Her large brown eyes are turned, which in unmistakable language indicate her unfaltering disposition and fixed purpose. The little finger of her left hand rests upon her lip, her head is thrown slightly forward, and the whole expression of her countenance says plainly, "I won't." The elder of the 2 is of rather darker complexion. A plate is shown on the floor beside the pouter's chair, which contains a piece of bread and a glass of water. On the wall to the left, 2 pans with long handles and also a jug are hung. To the right, in the distance, part of an iron pot is to be seen hanging over the fire. So this writer has seen this painting and has described it in great detail. The work right before it in the catalog is the other work that Yerkes owned, which is a very different painting indeed. This is a painting called Cupid's Realm. It's still in a private collection. And it falls into a different category. Bouguereau also painted a lot of paintings of women who were scantily clad. There are putti everywhere. They're like little swarms of bees. This particular painting is called Invading Cupid's Realm, and so you see this woman with this sort of swarm. I mean, it's really a swarm. Look at them all back there. Swarm of all these little puttis sort of fluttering around her, kind of making her the center of attention. Yerkes actually commissioned this painting from Bouguereau. So he owned your painting and he commissioned that one as well. So he really liked his work. Yerkes was a fascinating figure, pretty colorful. In fact, many of you probably know the Yerkes observatory, but which he quite famously built. But he was an incredibly colorful figure. He's more colorful than I want to go into to any great extent here. But I encourage you to read about him at some point if you're looking for something entertaining. He really epitomized the Gilded Age collector. He was actually born into a Quaker family, so came from relatively modest means. But he was deeply ambitious, this man. And he came to be known ultimately as a streetcar magnate. In fact, the L in Chicago is largely there because of Yerkes' efforts. Likewise, the Tube in London. So he had a lot to do with public transport. He was famously unscrupulous and underhanded. He spent some time in prison in Philadelphia. And he really capitalized on the corruption in Chicago, which was ultimately the city that he called his home. He routinely took bribes. He speculated wildly. He cheated on both of his wives. I mean, this was a man who had a lot going on, I guess. And in order to clean up his image, he did things like this. He built this observatory for the University of Chicago up in Lake Geneva. If you've never visited, I really encourage you to visit. It's super cool. It's an extraordinary thing to go see this, to really see the extent to which a man of quite problematic background the lengths he'd go to try to clean up his own image. The building of an art collection, likewise, was very similar. A sense of, suggesting to people that he was cultured and he was refined. So of course he's building this wonderful art collection. So he made all of these efforts to kind of make his image a bit better. Again, you should look him up someday. He's very entertaining. The final place that your painting is published is in connection with his widow, Mary Adelaide Yerkes. When she passed away in 1912, there was a posthumous sale of her collection, and the painting appears again. And we can see this is thankfully an annotated auction catalog, so we know that who it sold to, and we know that it sold for $2,100. And it sold to a person named D.G. Derry, who was very hard to track down. But again, here we have a description of the painting, 1912. The description reads as follows. A young woman is offered a ball of blue wool and some knitting needles to a little girl who poutingly abstains from taking them. She is seated on a low chair to the left of the composition, facing 3/4 to the right. From under lowered brows, her eyes are watching the spectator while the little finger of her left hand is held in her mouth and the right hand lies irresolutely on her creamy drab petticoat. The older girl seated beside her rests her left hand on the back of the girl's chair, leaning forward as if trying to look into the latter's face. She wears a comb in her hair, a dull red shawl crossed over her chemisette, and a gray-blue gingham apron that leaves exposed a little of the blue and olive gray striped skirt. The feet of both figures are bare. In the rear at the right, a pot hangs over some glowing embers, while in the front of the child's chair, a platter lies containing a tumbler of water and a section of loaf. So again, we know that it sold for $2,100 to D.G. Derry in 1912 as a result of this auction. From there, it goes through several different collections, moving every about 10 years or so. Ultimately ending up in the collection of Mrs. J.M. Scott, who then sold it to Mrs. John M. West in Manitowoc in 1976. I had the great pleasure of learning about the Wests in preparation for this lecture, and really you should be very pleased to have had such wonderful benefactors in this city. They really did an extraordinary thing. So I really think, to me, it's a pleasure to change, and so interesting, and in a way really refreshing to have an artist who actually is willing to admit that, to own that, and to say that this is who I am as an artist, this is what I'm doing. And he made an incredible success of himself, and he also made some really beautiful pictures that so many of us really love. I love his work. So I think it's a delight to be able to talk about Bouguereau. I'm really honored and pleased to have been asked here, and I thank you for your lovely time, and I'm also happy to answer questions, but thank you.
To the illustrations in the books, those were still in the late 1800s, and I know they had photography then. How did they reproduce or make an illustration to put in a book from a painting at that time? Do you know?
Oh, something like this?
Yeah, how did that come about? What happened?
So some of them are, this one I don't think, this is more of a photographic one, because this one is 1912.
Oh, okay.
But earlier ones like
like that.
This or here, those are engravings. Sometimes they're wood engravings.
That's what I was wondering. Yeah. I just didn't know if they like had an artist do an engraving of it, or if the artist himself provided something that somebody else then did the engraving, or how that all came about with the printing and all of that.
There
do notice the differences.
And if you look through Bouguereau's catalog raisonné, there are sometimes multiple versions of the same composition, one large, one small, and the small one was created for reproductive purposes. So,
I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the fluctuation of his reputation, say from 1912 when it was sold to, let's say, late 20th century, 1976, when it was purchased by Mrs. West.
His prices sort of towards the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, his prices started to dip, and he became increasingly unpopular. His paintings were seen as old-fashioned. They could be acquired for relatively little money, by comparison with how much his works were selling for earlier. And now his market has climbed back up again. So Bouguereau's routinely sell for multiple millions now. They're incredibly valuable, and so his reputation, his market, it's really a lot of up and down. But there was a period, I think, particularly when there was so much development in modern art and so many innovations, and to see Bouguereau's work next to something that was being painted in the 50s or the 60s would have felt really, dizzying almost. It's not a question of a slightly different style of paint application. This is just a different object entirely. So so it's interesting. There was a moment when it would have been really great to buy a Bouguereau. 50s and 60s would have been a really smart time to buy a Bouguereau.
So it's been kind of a big debate amongst staff here as to what type of material she's handing her.
Okay.
And I know I heard you say it's like kind of two different people call it two different things. Was there more of a consensus as to whether she was holding wool or yarn or what?
I mean, I think it's definitely knitting of some kind. What the actual material is not. It's not detailed enough to be clear. It's clearly blue, but and there's needles in it, but they're super tiny. I mean, I knit, not well, but I knit, and the knitting needles are not like these are really, really small. So it's a fine fabric, I would imagine. So it's a type of yarn, but I don't know what the textile is. I'm not sure. But yeah, it's interesting to see people's different interpretations of it. And I found it interesting that it was only the 1912 catalog that pointed out the comb in the elder girl's hair. Because if you're just looking at reproductions of it, you think, oh, she just has a really wide part. And then you look at the painting in person, and of course you see that it's a comb, that it's fixing this kind of curl of hair and tucking it in. And so I think it's interesting what the various authors see, how likely it is they saw the painting in person versus in a reproduction. So that's why I made you sit through all my reading of all of those descriptions. Yeah.
Are there any evidence or written work that William Alphonse Bouguereau himself actually told the story about any of his genre paintings, or did he just leave it up to the observer?
I think he largely left it up to the observer. There's some echoes in his personal life. So he lost a child at a very young age, a young son, and there's a really beautiful Pietà that he painted in the same year, or the year prior, or year after, I think, showing the Virgin with the dead Christ across her lap. It's a deeply moving picture. So there are moments when there are echoes of Bouguereau's sort of personal sentiment, but in terms of like, did he ever say, oh, it's a pair of sisters, and the elders, trying to teach her younger sister how to knit, and she's refusing. He never went into that much detail, so it was always, I think it was deliberately open-ended in a way, because I think that's one of the lovely things about Bouguereau genre paintings. You can kind of invent your own narrative to a certain degree, and there's nothing wrong with that. I don't think it's problematic. Yeah.
So that's what I got from it. What you were reading to us were other people's interpretations of that.
Yes.
And to me, when I looked at that, I did not leave out the possibility that the woman in the red was the mother of this child.
Very young mother, yes.
Yeah, but they were very young.
Sure, of course.
They were very young.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Okay, I know you went over this before, but how did Mrs. West get interested in acquiring this piece?
That's a great question that I actually don't know the answer to. Oh, wait, I think we have an answer from the audience.
Mrs. West was crafting a collection for the community, so she had a lot of different art advisors and different people in galleries that she worked with who were advising her on what to buy. She bought this pretty early on though, so we think that she liked this one a lot.
But I mean, do you think in her art she had a special interest in that period of art or something?
I would love to talk to her about some of her decisions. She's made some really interesting choices, and I unfortunately don't have any correspondence or anything like that about those choices.
Oh, that's a shame. That's so frustrating. So many collectors are like that. You can kind of line up the work they've acquired and try to infer, but it's hard. If they don't leave any evidence, it's difficult.
I wish it was still alive. So
Yeah, I know that feeling. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about your experience of putting the show together in the Milwaukee Art Museum?
Yeah. So it was a lot of fun. I had a really great co-curator, Stanton Thomas, who was then at the Memphis Brooks Art Museum and now is down in Florida at the Museum of Fine Arts in St. Petersburg. And he had started working on this show. I'll just give you the full backstory. He started working on this show a few years prior to when he reached out to me, and his colleague, Janino Grody, who was then at the Birmingham Museum of Art, quite tragically, she developed brain cancer and passed away. And but one of the things that she said to him was, Stanton, I want you to see this show through. And so he was kind of casting about for a curator to work with, and he knew that our picture was an important early American acquisition. And so he reached out to me and he said, would you lend, was really what he was asking. And I said, yeah, I'd lend, but I'd also like to work with you. And so we started talking and we got together in Memphis and we began developing what our checklist would be. And trying to figure how to balance it, how to figure out how much of any particular genre to include, which works to include. We traveled around and looked at various pictures. We had a great trip to New York and saw a bunch there, including at Lyndhurst. We went up to the along the Hudson River and visited it's crazy. You go into people's private homes, you see these things. It's amazing. And we built this checklist from there, and it was a tremendous amount of fun. And honestly, getting to know the paintings, but also getting to know all of the collectors that acquired the paintings over the years was great fun. One of the things we didn't do, but I wish we'd done in the catalog, was include in the index all of the professions that people made their money at. So you have like wallpaper makers and soap manufacturers and candy makers and crazy like breadth of ways that these people made these fortunes. But you get the sense that people were, sort of, they had these homes, they didn't know what to fill them with. I knew they had to have an art collection because it was the thing to do. And Bouguereau was a really a very accessible place to begin. So it was a lot of fun, and I'd always liked Bouguereau. I've always had a soft spot for Bouguereau. There are some of my colleagues in European art who sort of sneer, and and I think, well, come on. I mean, you have to give the man credit. He could paint. He's an amazing painter, and there are many artists, Andy Warhol, etc., who are very aware of the market. Peter Paul Rubens, very aware of the market, but we don't think less of them because of that. And so I think that to me, I think the exhibition was really about rehabilitating him and really making sure that people were aware that he fits into this larger nexus. So yeah, it was fun.
I mean, anyway, I think a lot of that criticism just came from jealousy,
Yeah.
overt,
I think so.
competitiveness.
Yeah. Particularly his fellow students at the academy. Yeah.
I love to read what the Impressionists wrote about him, so you should get it. A few weeks ago, Sonia and I were doing some research on women at the academies around 1880s, and we came across some information about his American wife, who was also a painter.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know much about her? Is there anything you can share?
Yeah, Elizabeth Jane Gardner Bouguereau. He lived with her for many years before they were married. She was his student. His mother, his long-suffering mother, who supported him when his father would not see of him going to art school and that sort of thing. She was very Catholic and would not do, because his first wife passed away, it would not do for him to marry again. So he had to wait until his mother passed away so that he could marry Elizabeth Jane Gardner Bouguereau. And unfortunately, her work is often denigrated. She's a very good painter. She's taken down because people think, oh well, he's just finishing the paintings for her, or he's painting that for her, and she gets to sign her name. But I don't think that's so. She has a distinct hand. You can see it when it's one of her paintings versus one of his. It's clear that it's not him painting, but her. There are some moments when I think they maybe work together on a work, but she's a really fascinating artist, and she's part of a whole group of artists. He had a school, and he taught a lot of women because the French Academy didn't accept women as students for many, I think until like 1890s or I think it's 1890s. Elizabeth Jane Gardner is a fascinating figure, but sadly they couldn't marry until very far along in their relationship, to wait for Mama Bouguereau to pass away.
Scandalous.
Very scandalous. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you.
Thank you.